Yo, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex, and this week's episode is the Phyrexia All Will Be One edition of the Gameplay Level Up episode. So I've been doing this episode once a format for the past 2 or 3 formats, and what we do here is we talk about gameplay. You know, this is one of the lesser talked about areas of Limited when it comes to podcasts and content in general. It's generally just easier to talk about drafting and deck building. But gameplay, as I always say, is so important. It's 50% of the game. I think when people are maybe stuck in a bit of a rut, maybe trying to get better at a format, they often look to, am I drafting poorly? Am I building poorly? But that's only half the battle, right? Being good at gameplay is really, really big. And honestly, it's what I would say makes the difference between a good player and a great player. People often ask me, what's the difference between like a platinum and a diamond and a mythic player? And I often say it's gameplay. You know, maybe the platinum and the diamond player are going to draft slightly differently, but especially late into the season, it's not going to be that much different. Where you do see a big separation or a big divide is the good players, they can play their deck really, really well. So I really want to touch on that today. The way I approach these gameplay episodes isn't so much, here's a game state, what would you do here, what's the play? I think that tends to be a little bit abstract, a little bit hard to apply to your own game, game in, game out. And the way I do approach it is I take about 20 cards that I picked out in the set to use those as jumping off points to talk about the context of how you want to play them in this set, small tips and tricks, how to play against those cards, but also I use them as a jumping off point to talk about just broader concepts, broader limited concepts that you can take to other formats. It's not like, all right, well, Phyrexia, we're almost done this format. It's only got a few more weeks left. I do want this to carry on, the stuff I talk about to carry on to other formats so you can use some of the tips and tricks that I talk about today in other formats as well. Just before we jump into that, of course, I do want to shout out the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. If you're enjoying the show, if you like what we do here, and if you want to support, check that out. It's one of the best ways to support the show, support any of my content, whether that be podcast, article writing, stream. It is the most direct way to support me. And of course, there's a bunch of ways that we want to give back to you. All the reward tiers over there are awesome. They're all focused on getting you better at Limited in some way. So if you're interested in leveling up your game, taking that next step, go check that out. All right, let's jump in. So often when I do these episodes, the first card or set of cards I like to talk about are kind of the marquee cards of the set, or just the cards that really inform the texture of the format, the cards you're going to see a lot. And for example, in Brothers War, I talked about the Unearthed cards for a long time, and the class of cards I want to talk about in this set is the combat tricks, because I think that that's the most applicable, not just to game in, game out in this format, but also to other formats too. We've seen a lot of really, really good combat tricks in the past year and a half, a lot of combat tricks that are either super efficient or generate value somehow. We've seen a bunch of like cantripping combat tricks, cards that generate value, draw you a card. And I think that this set in particular is really friendly to combat tricks. One, because there are very, very few, if any, decks that are like, 9 creature control decks. Those like just don't really exist in this format. So most decks are going to be playing combat tricks, or if not, you're going to be facing combat tricks. And also, I think that this set, it just has a lot of good combat tricks. It's got Complete Devotion, which is kind of a variant of those like generating value combat tricks I was talking about. It's got stuff like Free From Flesh, which is just super, super efficient. So these cards, if you've played any of this format, you're going to be playing against and with these cards draft in, draft out. I actually have a full episode on like a deep dive on combat tricks that I put out a few months ago. So if you want some more in-depth words on combat tricks, you can go check that out. One of the main points that I made in that episode is that combat tricks are most effective when you can somehow force your opponent to block. And usually this means you've got, a good curve of creatures, you're an aggro deck, your opponent is at risk of taking a bunch of damage, and so, your combat tricks become very effective because you play a 2-drop, they play a 2-drop, you attack, and they kind of have to block, and they're not going to have mana up, and often they're not going to have mana up because if you're continually putting pressure on the board, they're going to do the same. They're going to be like, okay, I have to put down a blocker. They can't cast a card draw spell or, hold up mana for something else, a counter spell or something. They need to get on the board, they need to tap out on their turn, and then your combat trick will be effective because they're not going to be able to respond to it very often. This is why combat tricks, even some of the better ones, aren't as good in mid-range or controlling decks, because you can't always guarantee that you're going to force your opponent to block. In this format, of course, the thing that makes your opponent block, aside from their life total, is toxic, right? You really don't want to take the first 3 points of toxic damage in this format. So when your opponent plays a Crawling Chorus on turn 1, you're very incentivized to block that with your 2-drop, even though you might sniff out that they have a trick. I'm going to touch on some thoughts on playing with these cards in a second, but I want to start with touching on how to play against them, because in general, when you think your opponent has a combat trick, it's not that bad of an idea to just say, okay, I'm going to block, you cast your combat trick, and we go on with our lives. Maybe you got a bit of a tempo advantage, but, you know, it was a 1-for-1 on cards. It was fine. And, of course, the problem in this format is that it's not a 1-for-1 a lot of the time. You block your opponent's toxic creature, they cast Complete Devotion, they're up a card, and you lost your creature, right? So what do you do in that situation? How do you mitigate that is the question. Well, unfortunately, the answer to that is, oh, you should just always block, or you should, just take it. Magic is much more complex than that, and if the answer was that easy, then it would not be a hard game. It would be an easy game, right? And so there's a lot of factors that go into that. I think in general, you kind of want to place yourself as a player on this spectrum of somebody who is often going to block and just call them on the combat trick, make them use it, or somebody who just goes, I'm going to take the damage a little more often than not. And I think there's like a happy medium to get to, because on one hand, if you just always take the damage, you say, I'm going to play around the combat trick, I don't want to lose my creature here, I know they have the combat trick. Often that comes back to bite you a little bit later on, because when, on turn 5, they're still going to have that combat trick in hand, and when you go for the block, maybe it's at a more important juncture in the game where not only they're winning the combat, but they get in a bunch of damage otherwise because they have other creatures attacking. Well, that makes you say, okay, maybe I should block a little bit earlier. But I think there's also a danger in always blocking on turn 2 or turn 3, because it is pretty bad when your opponent casts Complete Devotion, they draw a card, or even Free From Flesh, right? When they cast Free From Flesh on turn 3 and then play another 2-drop, yeah, you're even on cards, but you're down tempo there. And in a fast format, tempo is king. I've been saying that the first 3 turns of this format really shape how the rest of the game is going to go. If they go well for you, you're going to have a pretty good time. And if you kind of stumble, or if your opponent does have a few cards that line up really well against you, then that can kind of inform the trajectory of how the game's going to play out. So as much as I think that there is definitely that danger of calling too often, being like, okay, I'll just block, because that does lead to card disadvantage or a tempo disadvantage a lot of the time, I also think you should probably block in this format a little more often than not. Like the example I used before, the Crawling Chorus, I'm always going to block, or almost always going to block, when my opponent attacks their 1/1 Crawling Chorus into my 2/2 on turn 2. Here's the breakdown, right? Let's say you don't block. If you don't block, you take a poison, your opponent then can play a 2-drop, and they have that Complete Devotion in hand. Like, let's just assume this card is face up. They are showing it to you, right? That's pretty bad. And I think that's worse than your opponent casting Devotion. They waste their turn, quote unquote waste, right? They don't play another 2-drop is what I mean. And they go up a card. Because I much prefer being at a card disadvantage there than a tempo disadvantage in the early game. What I was just saying a second ago about the early game really informing how the game's going to go. Yes, they're up a card, but if the game is going to stop because you get run over, or, they just accrue an advantage, they get that first poison counter and they start running with it, and then their corrupted things turn on, that's much worse. I guess the way to boil this down is, I don't mind my opponent going up a card if it means that I can make them spend their turn 2. And to boil this down to the simplest terms, its card advantage is less important in the early turns, or it's less important to the impact of the game than tempo advantages. So I will block almost all the time versus Complete Devotion. Now, here are the times when I won't. One, if I have a cheap interaction spell in hand, I can just say, okay, you know what? I take that first point, they play a 2-drop, but I can probably Hex Gold Slash or Anointed Affliction, keep that up at some point. But you want to be careful there, right? Because if you don't have an opportunity to blow them out in the near future, I would still probably block. And what I mean by that is, even if you have a Hex Gold Slash in hand, but you can't also play a creature that turn. Like, let's say you've got a Hex Gold Slash and a 2-drop, okay? That's great, because you can go, I play my 2-drop, you're going to attack with your chorus, I get to Hex Gold Slash. But if your next play is a 3-drop, you can't hold up the mana. Next play after that is a 4-drop, you still can't hold the mana. That would lead me to want to block earlier rather than later. Because your opponent is they have no obligation to cast that trick unless they need to, right? So if your plan is, okay, I'm going to pass the turn, I'm going to hold up my Anointed Affliction, not play a creature, and they attack, they're just not going to use the trick, right? So you actually need to engineer a situation, if you want to be up in that exchange, to play a creature induce them into using that trick, and then blowing them out. You need the mana and the correct cards to do that. So that's a tricky situation. And this is, again, because that situation is tricky to get into, there's just not a lot of 1 and 2 mana instant speed interaction spells, that just leads me to blocking a little more often than not. The other reason I wouldn't block is if I feel like my 2-drop that I've played is of utmost importance, right? Maybe it's a Scrapgorger, right? An Arbor Scrapgorger, the mana production creature that maybe I need to cast, I don't have any more lands in hand, or I have a off-color card, or I feel like it's going to be really good to play my 4-drop a turn early, or it's just like, a premium 2-drop of some kind. Then maybe I would care enough to say, like, you know what, I don't want to get rid of this creature, right? Because part of that equation of them casting the Complete Devotion on turn 2 is they do get rid of your creature. I don't want to ignore that, right? And if your creature is high enough value and you think that you can ride that creature to a snowballing advantage, then you shouldn't block, right? That's the other thing with combat tricks, right? If you don't interact in combat, like you don't block, and you instead attack them back, you have another creature, you can play the next turn that attacks pretty well, you could just never give your opponent a great situation to cast that combat trick. Now, mind you, you have to be careful about that, because then at some point, if you're just ships in the night, you're attacking them, they're attacking you, they can use that combat trick for lethal, right? Or at a very critical juncture, like I noted before. But there is something to be said when you've got a very good proactive hand where you can just note, hey, I'm going to go Scrapgorger into 4-drop into 5-drop, where you might just not want to give the opponent an opportunity to use that trick. And also, by the time, if you can play like a beefy 4-drop early, well, maybe they can't even attack into your creature, even if they have that combat trick. So, to boil it down here, block more often than not, because the card advantage is less important in most games of this format than a tempo advantage is, and by not blocking, you give them a tempo advantage because they can play their 2-drop still. But you should not block if you can figure out a situation where you can react to that, both induce them into using the combat trick in a future turn, ideally a future turn that comes soon, or your 2-drop is very valuable. And the other thing to consider is, what if they don't have Complete Devotion or Blazing Crescendo in hand, right? What if it's like a Titanic Growth? Then, if you always pretend your opponent has Complete Devotion, if you always put that card in their hand, then you're losing out some equity somewhere, because you're always giving your opponent a better card than they actually have. Sometimes they attack with the chorus, and you do just 1-for-1 you Titanic Growth, and that's actively good for you, because, again, they have skipped their turn 2, and they're not up a card, and then you can then respond and play a 3-drop. You're actually advantaged in that situation if it is a non-value generating combat trick. And you can kind of apply everything I just said about playing against them to playing with them, but in the inverse. But it's actually a little more interesting when you're the one in the driver's seat. Like, say you're the one with the Crawling Chorus, right? And you've got a combat trick in hand. If you directly apply the inverse, that might lead you to believe that if you have a Crawling Chorus on turn 1 and they have a 2/2 and a trick, well, if your opponent's just going to block, then you shouldn't attack, right? Because if we have established that that's generally a bad exchange for you, right, to cast the combat trick because you're down tempo at that point, well, maybe you shouldn't cast the trick. I would say that that's actually kind of paradoxically not true, though, for 2 reasons. One, well, I was saying that, yes, it's probably worse to let your opponent play their 2-drop, not block, not make them use their trick, but it's still pretty good when you get to cast Complete Devotion. Like, both of those things are positives for you. Either they block or they don't block. Either situation, if you have Complete Devotion in your hand, that's a pretty good thing. So as far as, like, if both players are playing perfectly, what's the optimal thing for both people to do? Well, while I think the defender, it is optimal for them to block a lot of the time, it's also still right for the aggressor to attack, because both of those outcomes are good for you. The other thing you can consider is, if you're playing optimally, sure, you could say, yes, it's best to always block, but your opponents who are on the defense, they might not always be playing optimally. So, everything I was just describing, how I think you should optimally play against these cards, your opponents might not have that in mind. They might be afraid of the trick in the spot where they actually should block, right? So not only is it a good outcome no matter what, if you attack your 1/1 into their 2/2 and you've got a Complete Devotion in hand, you're happy either way. But sometimes it's even better for you because you attack and your opponent makes the wrong choice, right? This is a situation where you can make your opponent, induce them into making a poor choice. And again, the floor there is so high because either thing they do is really good for you. So I would in most spots still attack my Crawling Chorus in, and I think that's obvious. I think if you've played this format, casting Complete Devotion on your 1-drop does feel pretty good, even if you've got a 2-drop in hand. Another thing I'll say with playing with tricks in general in this format, or just in general any format, is you do really have to realize that your opponent is a thinking player. They touched on this on limited resources this week a little bit, and I just want to like hammer this home either for people that haven't listened to that episode, or just like maybe that they glossed over that part. But basically, what Luis was saying, and I wholeheartedly agree with this, is you just really need to make sure that, okay, so let's say your opponent, you do attack your Crawling Coruscant on turn 2, and your opponent goes, okay, no blocks. Well, when they do pass the turn back, they've got 3 mana, maybe their 2-drop is on the battlefield still. You can't expect that combat just to go well for you. You have to expect, okay, they might have a Hexgold Slash at this point, or a Anoint, right? This is their turn where you can actually get a big advantage by realizing, oh, hey, I shouldn't just use this trick right here and figure that it's going to go as well as it did the last time, where I can just get in my damage. I can make them waste their mana that they were planning to use an instant on, or at very least, I don't get blown out. Maybe they use their instant on your 3-drop you play, right? But just don't let yourself get into that position where you're the one blinking first and they can react to that, right? You never want to be the person using the proactive combat trick early in the game when your opponent has mana up, because that's almost never going to end up well for you. All right, so that's all I have to say about combat tricks. Let's get into some more individual cards here. So first things first is Indoctrination Attendant. So this is the 4-mana common 3/4 toxic one that when ETBs you can pick up a permanent, and if you do, you make a 1/1 might token. So the first thing I want to say about this card is the thought that you don't need to Stone Rain yourself with this card. I've seen a lot of opponents, even opponents that are, I've got a good beatdown going and they're a little bit behind, they pick up their land if that's their only permanent just to make a might. Well, Magic cards are flexible, they're modular. You want to make sure that in a given situation, you're using your card for what the game and that certain game demands. And in that spot, I don't know all of my opponent's hands, but I imagine that when they don't have anything on board and they have a bunch of cards in hand, it's probably a benefit for them to not pick up a land and effectively miss their next land drop just for a might that can't block. So, I've been repeatedly surprised when people pick their lands up when I've got like a bunch of creatures on board just to get that little bit of value. And that's something you have to fight it against a lot of the time, where I know, it's very easy to get stuck in that, like, oh, get value, like use all my cards how they were intended, how I expected them to act when I put them in my deck. But, you just got to recognize that a certain game just won't let you do that, right? The game's going to demand that you cast your cards in a timely fashion, you get blockers down. It's not, you're not the aggressor. You don't have to, you're not forced to pick up a land with this, right? The other thing I want to mention is it's a bit of a deck building, drafting thing, more than gameplay, but, you want to think about, like, what is this card doing in your deck? And I don't think it needs to do anything in particular. I think it's just a great card. I actually think it's one of the more underrated cards in the set. As far as, now that things have panned out and most card evaluations are kind of, people understand how good or how not good some cards are. I think this one actually still goes a little bit late. And the number one place I want Indoctrination Attendant in the best deck for it is red-white, because the best thing you can pick up, or, just about the best thing, are the equipment, right? The 4 Mirrodin equipment, because that generates a full card's worth of value. And not only do you generate a full card's worth of value by picking up an equipment and replaying and getting a new 2/2, but in red-white, when you have equipment, well, that might you're generating turns into a real card, right? Sometimes if you're playing black-white, you don't have maybe any of the white equipment, and that might just kind of sits there. That's okay too. Sometimes you can, just on a big turn attack all, and that might gets in. But if you can turn that might into a 3-power creature somehow, that makes it a lot better. So just worth noting, I generally tend to play this card in my red-white decks as my 4-drop of choice, in tandem with Chimney Rabble if I can get it. Also, just in general, just like kind of jumping off of what I was saying before, don't be hesitant necessarily about playing it when you can't get value. Like sometimes the 3/4 blocker, that's what you need, right? That's what the game demands. And I've definitely had turns where I've been like, can I afford to get value? Can I wait on this? And just realize, like, no, I need the 3/4 blocker. And 3/4 is a good blocker in this format. Like, that wins against a lot of combat tricks. 4 toughness is a lot. So don't be afraid to play this out without value, is I guess what I'm getting at here. Next up, we've got Chrome Prowler. So this is the 3 mana, 2 and a blue, 3/2 flash that when it enters the battlefield, you can tap a creature your opponent controls. So this card, the thing I want to point out with this card is, just like the last card, you're talking a bit about the modularity of this card. This card has 3 main modes, right? And the main modes are cast this proactively to tap down a blocker, cast this defensively to tap down an attacker, or cast this in combat to surprise either eat like a 1/1 or trade with something in combat that they maybe didn't want to trade off. And I think you want to recognize all three of those modes, because I think it's very easy to get caught in the flash trap here of always using it as a flash creature, right? Just like, just like the whole thing where it's like, well, often newer players will always use instants at instant speed on the opponent's turn, even though it might be good to play around a protection spell, or, if it's a burn spell, it's good to play around a combat trick. Same thing here. I think a little too often people don't recognize the sorcery speed mode of tap down a blocker and attack, right? That is definitely a mode of the card. But also the other two, the defensive modes, where sometimes, I think most often you'll cast this as, okay, I tap one of your things down and I get to threaten to block something else. But sometimes you don't want to let them know that you have a 3-power blocker coming up, and you just let them go to attacks. So the times when this will happen are, A, if your opponent has a pretty good creature that you just want to ambush, right? You're just like, okay, I don't mind just like trading this off, and I don't want them to not attack with it. The most obvious case is if they have like a 1/3, right? Like say they have a 1/3 and a 3/2, right? And then they're attacking you, and you don't have a board. Well, it's great to potentially eat that 1/3. That's fantastic. But sometimes even just like an opposing creature that you just want off the battlefield. For example, a Charforger, right? Or just anything that like generates value, right? Charforger is the black-red uncommon. Even if my opponent has multiple creatures, as long as I'm not in danger of taking too much damage, like sometimes you just have to tap something down and then threaten to block something. If I'm at 18 and my opponent's got 2 creatures, one of them's a Charforger, I'll just flash in my Chrome Prowler after attacks have happened and eat the Charforger, or not eat it, but block it. So just consider all 3 modes of this card. It's very important to for every Magic card, there's hidden modes everywhere, right? And this one in particular, I think, has a few hidden modes that don't get used as often as I might generally. Next up, we've got Gitaxian Raptor. So this is the 2 and a blue 1/4 flyer that enters with 3 oil counters, and you can remove an oil counter to give it +1, -1 until end of turn. So the thing with this card you generally want to consider is when are you taking off the oil counters, and how much oil are you taking off? If you are firmly the beatdown, I could definitely consider taking off oil proactively just to get in damage while you can, so that if they do eventually remove this card, well, you didn't give up some damage, right? Let's say you are the beatdown and you want to guarantee some damage. It's tempting to just keep all that oil on just to say like, all right, like I've got this for a rainy day when I need to pump it, or in some maybe I need to trade with something. But if you're firmly pulling ahead, you want to close out the game, it's pretty safe just to take a few oil counters off and get in that damage, because you rather get in that damage than them draw a removal spell and you missed out on that damage on a later turn. You do often want to consider keeping 1 oil counter, of course, if you've got enough proliferate, because if you run out of oil, then you won't have that option. The other thing, and this is the most important thing about this card to consider, is you don't want to remove oil if you're not firmly the beatdown, at least when you're attacking, because if you do that, that gives up one of the main attractions about this card. One of the main things I like about this card is that it plays very well as a blocker against combat tricks. So let's just say, you were kind of the beatdown, and then maybe the opponent started to stabilize, and you took off 2 of the oil counters. So you only have 1 oil counter. You don't have anything that proliferates. So now you can only oscillate between a 1/4 and a 2/3. And the great thing about the Raptor is it can go up to a 4/1, and that beats most combat tricks, at least early on, right? When your opponent attacks their 2/2 in, they cast a Blazing Crescendo. Okay, well, you get to still trade off, right? And by removing that option, that's pretty bad, right? Because then your card just doesn't do what you want it to do. So to break this down, if you're firmly the beatdown, feel free going down to 1 or 0 oil. But if you think that in a future turn you might need to block with this, consider just attacking for 1 and keeping the 3 oil on it, because you never know when you're going to want to need to trade up if they have a combat trick. Next up, we've got Tamiyo's Immobilizer. So this is the Axiom Manipulator variant at uncommon. Comes with 4 oil counters. You can tap it, remove an oil counter to tap target creature or artifact. Mostly the thing I want to point out about this card is how it highlights each player's intentions when they have them. So sometimes, it's once again, kind of like with the Gitaxian Raptor situation, sometimes it's very clear that you're the beatdown, or sometimes it's very clear that the opponent's the beatdown, and if your opponent's the beatdown, then every single turn, you're most likely going to be using this to take an attacker out of the equation, right? But if your opponent and you are kind of a parity, you're kind of not exactly sure who's the beatdown, you're trying to wrangle for the beatdown role, and maybe both players have a few cards in hand, it's really important to recognize when the opponent does and doesn't use the Immobilizer. Because if let's say you go to combat and you go, okay, I have a pretty good attack here. And maybe the opponent has open mana, maybe they don't, and they choose not to use the Immobilizer. That sets alarm bells off to me, because that says to me that they believe you should attack there, right? Because they're almost making you make a mistake, because they go, okay, sure, like, you attack, because often what will happen, if you find yourself in that situation, you go, okay, like, I guess I'm going to attack here, and you do attack. Well, they go end of turn, tap something else. Maybe they cast a removal spell at the end of turn as well. And then you're like, wow, I'm in a much worse position than I was because I didn't expect them to have a removal spell. So this works the opposite way too. When you choose not to use the Immobilizer, that tells your opponent a lot. And maybe some opponents won't pick up on it for sure, but just be aware of the information that you are sending when you don't activate the Immobilizer. I'm not saying that you shouldn't not activate it, right? The information is an intangible thing, and actually getting not attacked is a tangible thing, or you know, making your opponent, potentially inducing them into attack that they shouldn't make. That's a tangible thing, right? You always want to value the tangible over the intangible in a game of Magic. But just worth noting that something like Immobilizer, or something, you know, to make this a broader point, anything that your opponent could do but then doesn't, that gives you information, and that's very valuable going forward. Next up, we've got Ambulatory Edifice. This is the uncommon 2 and a black 3/2 that when it enters the battlefield, you can pay 2 life, and if you do, target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn. So this is another card that kind of has hidden modes that I think are a bit underutilized sometimes. So often when you draw this card, you look on the battlefield and you go, okay, does my opponent have any X1s? And you know, sometimes they do, and you go, great, I can snipe that, that's great. And sometimes they don't, and you kind of go, okay, well, I'll just play this out as a 3/2. And that's fine, sometimes you do just play it out as a 3/2, but I would also look for opportunities where you can use this post-combat on your turn. So a very simple example is you got a 2/2, maybe it's like a Mirrodin token that's just kind of lying around. Your opponent's got a 3/3. Well, you know, it's a pretty good exchange to go, I attack with my 2/2, they block with the 3/3, post-combat, give it -1/-1, right? But, you know, there's a lot of combat situations that are analogs to that. It might not exactly be a 2/2 and a 3/3, but just be on the lookout for that. That's definitely a point that, you know, I think it's very easy to gloss over. Once again, there's an intended use. You think, oh, I put this in my deck to snipe off X1s, but it can be very valuable post-combat. And of course, this is also true for both Hazardous Blast and Cinderslash Ravager, the green-red uncommon, right? Just look for those post-combat situations. And this is especially relevant because sometimes it can feel like, man, this Hazardous Blast is kind of just rotting in my hand. What's it doing? You know, you can make use of a card that maybe you're not anywhere close to killing the opponent with it, but you might be in a position where you go into a combat and you can eat 2 things post-combat. And especially works well if your opponent is in a position where they're going to double block. Because often when they double block, it'll be like, okay, I've got just enough to double block and keep one of my creatures alive, and then either Edifice, Hazardous Blast, or Ravager can finish those off. So just something to keep an eye out for. Next up, we've got Barbed Batterfist. This is 1 red for the 4 Mirrodin equipment. The equipped creature gets +1/-1. So the main thing I want to talk about this card is using it for haste damage, because I think this is something that I'm definitely guilty of, just like going to attacks and then just going, oh wait, I could have just cast my Batterfist, equipped it, I had a good attack, and I could have gotten an additional point, right? I think that's something that like I've done it myself, I've witnessed my opponent miss out on it. It's a very easy thing to miss. So don't miss out on that additional point. It's going to be the difference maker in a lot of games. The other thing to note about this card is figuring out where you should move it, and both on offense and defense. And on defense, when if you pass the turn and you want to make good blocks somehow, you do have to consider, okay, well, if I'm giving something -1, not only is that block worse in combat, although sometimes it blocks better, because sometimes you can help, your 2/3 trade up, you make it a 3/2, it trades the thing they have, but also that expose it to some amount of interaction spells, right? I just touched on a bunch of things that give -1 or things that punish 1 toughness creatures. You do kind of want to avoid that sometimes if your opponent's playing black or red-green. But even just exposing it to like a Hexgold Slash or something, that's something you should definitely consider if you're playing against red. So I guess I would say if you're playing against red, unless you feel like equipping it will give you a better trade because you can have your small creature or small powered creature trade up, don't put it on your creature you plan to block with. And maybe that's a bit simple, a bit rudimentary, but it's definitely something that I had to learn the hard way because I was like, oh, great. Like a lot of times I would equip it thinking, oh, I should equip it now, use my mana now, because it saves me mana next turn because I'm planning to attack with this creature next turn, and then you get a little bit punished. The other thing is, of course, figuring out where to put it for attacking purposes, right? Where you put that +1. And again, that's a bit modular. It's a bit hard for me to give like overarching rules for where you should do it. But in general, I would put it on a creature that doesn't have a good attack, first of all, or has an evasive ability, right? You kind of want to ask yourself, am I in the point of the game where I care most about making good trades in combat, or do I want to push damage? If your opponent's lower on life total, you should put it on a first striker or a menace creature, because that pushes more damage and makes your opponent's blocks a little more awkward. But if your opponent's got a pretty high life total, you probably want to put it on a creature that doesn't attack well already, and so that that creature can attack, and either you force your opponent to have kind of an awkward block, or you force in some damage if they don't want to block that. So yeah, it's a very modular card, a lot of things to consider, and I would just say, when you have a Batterfist in play, it's, I was talking about that kind of hidden modes on a lot of cards. This card has, like, so many hidden modes, because you have to think about all the permutations of what it does when you equip it to a different creature, right? Or all the permutations of if you're putting a Hexgold Slash in your opponent's handle, or Volt Charge, like, what does that mean? So it's a very tricky card to play right, I believe. But just like I say often about any gameplay situation, or just like anything in Magic in general, the more you start thinking about it, the more it becomes easier, and the more you can commit it to second nature quicker. So just in general, as when you have Batterfist in play, take a second, basically. Don't just autopilot. Think about where it best goes on which creature and how to optimize it. Next up, we've got Axiom Engraver. So this is the 1-red, 1/3 that enters with 2 oil counters, and you can tap it to remove an oil counter to discard a card. So the number one thing with this card is I'm very, very resistant to pitching anything but a land with this card. Unless you need a land, right? And then you can pitch a spell. But generally, there comes a point in a game when maybe you have some okay spells in hand, and you're like, hey, this isn't exactly what I need, but maybe you're not in a dire situation or you need to dig to something right away. A lot of the times, I'll be streaming and Twitch chat will be like, oh, maybe you should pitch a spell here and dig to a better spell. Well, the problem is most of the time, you're not going to upgrade your card on average if you are just discarding a spell, like any spell in general, because half the time, or maybe a little less than half the time, you're going to draw a land. So you're going to be downgrading your card. So unless you really, really need to find something right now, I just wouldn't discard a spell, because you're going to draw lands eventually, right? And then you can use that and discard the land. Then it's so much better to guarantee, or at least, almost guarantee upgrading your land, because either you draw another land or you draw into a spell, rather than have a chance of downgrading your card. And this is something that I've definitely seen my opponents very proactively do, discarding cards early in the game, discarding spells to find maybe slightly better spells. The other thing to consider with this card is consider when you need it for a blocker, because in a late game situation where maybe you have drawn a land and it's a tight game and you're like, oh, I really need a spell, and you've got a few creatures, one of them being Axiom Engraver, your opponent's got a few more creatures than you and they've got pretty good attacks, I would definitely consider not just activating right away on your turn, because a lot of the time you have to consider what taking Axiom Engraver out of the equation on blocks actually does. Sometimes, just like that previous situation I was talking about where you have the chance to upgrade your spell, but it's not guaranteed, sometimes you have the chance to upgrade Axiom Engraver from a decent blocker, a 1/3, to a better blocker, maybe you draw a 3/3 or something, but you also have the chance to downgrade it, and giving up that opportunity to block is very costly in a lot of games. Like, imagine the situation where you really need a blocker, or you maybe don't really need it, because once again, if you really need something, of course you do activate it if that's your only choice, but maybe it's like, I would like to be in a better position here, but it's not dire. You tap it, you discard your last land, and you draw another land, but now you're down a blocker. So just consider, is it really, really important to activate this Engraver now? If not, it's probably just better to keep it for a blocker for another turn cycle. Next card up is Volshock Splitter, which is the 3-red equipment that gives +2/+0. It's got for Mirrodin, equip cost 2 in a red. And this is kind of just a proxy for any equipment that generates a power or toughness boost. When you're playing against these types of cards, if you have the option to block either this or another similar powered threat when your opponent's attacking you, it's generally better to block the other thing, right? Because if you block the creature that has the splitter on it, like the 2/2 with the splitter on it, you're really only trading for a 2/2, right? Because they keep the equipment around and they can put it on something else. And this is just a small thing that I've noticed, a small little inefficiency that I've seen people do sometimes, where it could just be literally the situation of they've got a Volshock Splitter, a 4/2, and a Urbrask's Anointer, another 4/2. And Or I will have that, and they'll block the splitter, right? And I'm not sure exactly the logic there, but it's just better to block the 4/2. So just small thing about that, and again, this applies to any other equipment, as long as the creatures that are attacking are about equivalent. Of course, if your opponent's attacking with a 4/2, and that's the only big thing, and you have to block it, yeah, you have to trade it off, of course. But there's definitely something to be said for not giving your opponent value, quote-unquote, not letting them be able to trade up, because really, once again, it is just a 2/2, and then re-equipping that. So just something to think about there. Next up, Armored Scrapgorger, the 1 and a green 0/3 mana dork that taps for any color of mana and becomes a 3/3 at some point. So the thing I want to mention about this card is, of course, don't forget that this is graveyard hate, and I've been punished by this myself, where I've had Scrapgorger on the battlefield, and I've just got lazy, and I didn't exile my opponent's graveyard when I could, right? I just didn't tap it for mana at the end of my opponent's turn, and it ended up punishing me somehow. You know, they have a reanimation spell or just something to interact with their graveyard, right? There are a few cards, not a ton in this format that do that, but there are a decent number of cards that do bring stuff back from the graveyard. So don't get gotten by just being lazy with this card. Exile your opponent's creatures when you can. Next up, we got one of the big boogeymen of the format. This is Cinderslash Ravager. Everybody knows this one, for better or for worse. This is the 6 mana 5/5 green-red golden common, costs 1 less for each permanent you control with an oil counter on it. It has vigilance, and it deals 1 damage to each creature your opponents control when it enters. So I want to talk about playing against this card and kind of preemptively thinking about your opponent might have this card if they're playing red-green. I talked a little bit in an earlier episode about this format where generally if you have the option, it's good to interact with your opponent's synergy pieces early on, because that lessens the effectiveness of their cards as the game goes on. So if you have the option to kill your opponent's cheap toxic creature, their cheap, their pestilent siphoner, it's a pretty good idea to do that so that they don't get corrupted, right? They don't turn corrupted on early. And the same thing applies, I think, for the oil creatures. If your opponent has a lot of oil creatures, or they have a green-red deck and they have a few oil things in the battlefield, and you're a deck that's particularly susceptible to getting your creatures dealt 1 damage, I will more proactively than I might normally, use an interaction spell so that this doesn't cost 1 more mana. Maybe it takes 1 more turn for this to come down, and it makes things a little bit awkward. I had a very poignant example of this the other day on stream, where I had a Crawling Chorus, a Bilious Skulldweller, and a Might token. And this is turn 3. My opponent had an Exuberant Fuseling. It was a 3/1 Fuseling and an Evolving Adaptive. And I passed the turn, and I had an Anointed's Affliction in hand. And I could have just waited. I was like, okay, I can just wait, cast my removal spell. But it's so bad here if my opponent casts Ravager on this turn, right? And they have the mana. They can play a land. They can play it. And I'm probably going to want to get rid of either this Fuseling or this Adaptive anyways, right? Like, there's definitely a benefit to waiting. Maybe they play something that's better than a Fuseling or an Adaptive, but both of these are pretty good cards. And it just completely wrecks me if my opponent has a Cinderslash Ravager here. And I did get it, I did end up getting gotten. They had the Ravager, they decimated my board, and I think if I just had 1 more turn where I got in a hit with a few toxic creatures, I could get my opponent corrupted, this game would have panned out much better for me. So just something to think about. If your board is particularly susceptible to Cinderslash Ravager, consider using that removal spell a little more proactively than you might otherwise. All right, moving on to a few rares here just to close this out. Evolved Spinoderm. So this is 2 green for a 5/5. Enters with 4 oil counters on it. It has trample as long as it has 2 or fewer oil counters. Otherwise, it has hexproof. And at the beginning of your upkeep, you remove 1, and then if it has an oil counters, you sacrifice it. So this is just a very small quirk to note, but I've had multiple games where this has come up. The interaction with this card and Free From Flesh is something you need to watch out for, because I've had a lot of opponents go for lethal because they had a trampling Spinoderm and they had Free From Flesh, and they're like, okay, I'll just give it +2/+2. It's a 7/7. They block it, and I trample over for lethal. But the tricky thing, of course, is you put oil counters on from Free From Flesh, and it loses trample and regains hexproof. So it's just one of those situations where it really helps to read all the text on your cards. We often get trapped into like mental models or just like shortcuts of what we think the card will do, and a lot of times there's like trinket text or just ways that cards line up in funny ways that it does just pay to read your cards once or twice more. So that's not going to be a common thing. This is a rare, not going to come up often, but did want to point it out, and just something to keep your eye out for. And then the last card I want to talk about is Thrun. So Thrun, Breaker of Silence. This is the 5 mana 3 green 5/5, can't be countered, trample, indestructible as long as it's your turn, and it can't be targeted by non-green spells. So the thing I want to talk about here is kind of how to beat Thrun, because a lot of times, Thrun is a proxy for anything that is difficult to deal with, because I have beat this card a lot more often than I have lost to it, and I think a lot of people have had the other experience, the opposite experience, where it comes down and they just lose. And not to say that I haven't gotten a little bit lucky, been in good positions, but I've put myself in good positions, just building in a way that you're on board early, and this comes down, and it's not just the biggest deal in the world. It's not just going to end the game because you have no way to answer it. My big point with this is often when your opponent plays a card with hexproof or it's hard to deal with in some way, it can be very deflating because you go, well, how do I deal with that? And I think often people go to, how do I get that off the battlefield? And that's not often the puzzle you're trying to solve. Because obviously with this one, you can't. Unless you have a punch spell or a fight spell, it's very, very difficult to. And so if that's not an option, well, how are you getting it off the battlefield? How are you winning the game? Well, you go to player removal, not creature removal. You try to win the game. And the ways that I have beaten Thrun is racing it or going around. Now, yes, of course, you're not always in the position to do that. But if I'm in a position where maybe I was trying to be a bit more defensive and then Thrun comes down, I switch gears and I go, I can't be defensive. My opponent's going to win the game in 3 turns. I have to try to race them. Or, recognize the times when you go, all right, Thrun comes down, it's a problem, but I've got a pretty big board. I can definitely attack past it. If they want to stay back with Thrun, that means they feel their life total is in danger. They're not attacking with Thrun. That's good too. So just consider, because I've definitely seen a lot of players that have been in okay positions to beat Thrun, get a bit deflated and take the win, they knock the wind out of their sails. But, just take to heart the fact that this isn't a card that you should expect to kill by any regular means, right? But there is a lot of ways around it. It's not an unbeatable card. You can win a game of Magic without dealing with all of your opponent's threats, right? There's definitely ways to skirt around that a little bit. And that's all I have for today. So thank you so much for listening and watching. Normally I record this live on Twitch. I'm actually not live today, just the way my schedule lined up. But I did ask some Discord members for any questions that they might have had to have a little bit of audience interaction. So I've got a few more cards to just talk about that were spurred on by some thoughts that some people in the Discord have. So the first question I got was, is there ever situations where you'll play your creatures off curve so that you get a bonus from them later? Or, you're not being the most mana efficient, but there's something that'll want you to not cast the card. How are you weighing that? And one of the more common situations where this comes up is you've got a Flensing Raptor, the 2 and a white 2/2 flyer that jumps a toxic creature, and you don't have a toxic creature. And it feels like, you're giving up a little bit of value. Well, I would say that if you don't have any other 3-drops, you definitely just play this, right? You just play it for the turn. It's going to be good by virtue of you're playing your toxic creature. It's going to get in some damage. That's just good enough. Yes, you don't get the full value of the card, but that's okay. If you have a other option, maybe you have a Contagious Vorak, maybe I'll play that first, maybe. But if I have like a worse 3-drop, like a much worse 3-drop, something like a Adaptive Spore Singer, the 2/2 Vigilance for 3 that comes in, pump something. Well, I hope to not have that card in my deck, but sometimes that is good enough, right? I'll say, okay, I've got a 2-drop. I'll play that 3-drop because it pumps my 2-drop. It gives me an attack. But let's say you didn't play a 2-drop on turn 2. I wouldn't play a worse 2-drop just because I have Flensing Raptor in hand. You should just play that. Now, there's definitely some give and take here. There are situations, like it's not a hard and fast rule. It's not like you should never not play the Flensing Raptor on turn 3. Like I just said, if you have a Vorak, if you have comparable options, it's definitely reasonable to hold on to that, right? But don't feel like you should hold this because so much of limited Magic is just about using all of your mana every turn, right? Just like, think about how good it is when your opponent goes 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop. It almost doesn't matter, right? If they went Crawling Chorus into non-toxic 2-drop into Flensing Raptor, well, I guess they'd have the Crawling Chorus. But let's say it's an Evolving Adaptive, right, on turn 1. Well, if they then just play the Flensing Raptor and you're under some pressure, I mean, it's still a 2/2 flyer, right? The other situation this might come up is with Evolving Adaptive, the 1-mana 1/1 that grows, and sometimes you will sequence your creatures in a way that is a little bit off curve so that you can grow your creature, or at least you'll think you might want to do that. And this is another situation that's a little bit unclear because sometimes it's a good thing to do. I would say that all things equal, if you think that your 3 toughness 2-drop, like let's say even Armored Scrapgorger, is just as good as your other creature, it's a 2/2, that, if you go Adaptive into 2/2, grow the Adaptive, and then on turn 3 you play a 3 toughness creature, maybe it's the Scrapgorger, and you grow it again. Well, if those two creatures are comparable, then sure, you can do that. But if you think that the Scrapgorger is just better to play on turn 2, and most of the time it will be, because Scrapgorger is a great thing to play on turn 2, so you can develop your mana further, play a 4-drop early, you should just play that. So basically, it's you kind of have to order your priorities. Yes, it's great to get the most value out of your card, grow the Adaptive, but you also have to weigh, it's probably just better to play my cards on curve or just put my best foot forward, play the cards that, yes, and maybe I missed out on the counter, but I'll be able to get an advantage some other place. So you kind of just want to weigh what's the advantage you're gaining. Are you more happy with the counter, or are you more happy that you can play your 4-drop return earlier? Generally, you're going to be happier to play your 4-drop return earlier. And now it's not always going to be the Scrapgorger example, but you just want to weigh what's the outcome in a few turns. That's kind of what you want to think. And the same thing applies with the Flensing Raptor, right? It's never clear cut, but you just want to think about what's going to happen in a few turns, what's my board going to look like, and what's the opportunity cost of not just playing it now. Next question I received was, what do you do with the Skull Bomb, specifically Surgical Spell Bomb? Do you save it to not let your opponent know that you have it? Because, getting out on the battlefield is only 1 mana, it's not that much. Do you just play it on turn 1? Generally, I just play it on turn 1 if I have it. Like, there's slight value in withholding the information that you have this card from your opponent, but there's also a lot of value on not wasting 1 mana, right? Just like I was saying before, when you're making these types of decisions, it's always good to value the tangible over the intangible. So yes, you give your opponent a little bit of information, but that 1 mana that you've wasted is a tangible thing. And even if in your opening hand it doesn't look like it's going to bite you, you never know how your draw is going to pan out. And you could be like, okay, I've got a 2-drop and a 2-drop and the Skull Bomb. I can play 2-drop and Skull Bomb on turn 3. That's great. But you might just draw a good 3-drop and you want to play that too. So just use your mana. You're going to win a lot of games of Magic, a lot of games limited, just using all your mana each turn. And then last thing, this is more of a deck building thing than a drafting thing, but somebody was asking, what do you think about Nahiri's Sacrifice? This is the 1 in a red sorcery at uncommon that you can sacrifice a permanent, or specifically an artifact or creature, mana value X. Nahiri's Sacrifice deals X damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures. I would also lump in, against all odds, the thing that blinks something and buys back or reanimates a 3 mana cost creature from the battlefield, and Gleeful Demolition kind of in this conversation. Gleeful Demolition is the single red sorcery that blows up an artifact, and if it was yours, you make 3 1/1s. All of these cards, I would entertain the idea of playing if I've got like 6 or 7 for Mirrored equipment. Because the key to these cards is you don't ever want to be blowing up a actual creature with Gleeful Demolition or sacrificing a real creature. You want to be sacrificing something that isn't a full card's worth of value. The other 2 cards, Gleeful Demolition and Against All Odds, I'm a little more likely to put in my deck than sacrifice, because with those 2 cards, it doesn't matter what the card costs. And so Batterfist, the Barbed Batterfist, is a really good thing to blink or to blow up. It doesn't matter what it costs, but with Nahiri Sacrifice, you really want to be sacrificing like a 4-drop. So you really have to have like Volshock Splitter or something more expensive, Mirrodin Bardiche, and that's a little bit too finicky. What I would say is that this might, all of these cards actually, all 3 of the cards I just mentioned, kind of I would classify as the best of the bad cards when you're trying to figure out your 20 to 23rd card. I never really want to play any of those cards main deck. Sometimes Against All Odds has specific situations where it's really good. You have a lot of good blink targets. You have a lot of good 3-drop creatures. You can definitely play it. But for Nahiri Sacrifice, I generally don't play it unless I really, really have to. And the next playable I would play is like, a really bad card in my sideboard. It would have to be pretty obnoxiously bad for me to not play it over Nahiri Sacrifice. So consider if you're missing a playable, if you also have 6 to 7 for Mirrored equipments, then this card and those other cards become playable. If not, I would just say, just don't consider it really. And that's our show for today. Thank you so much for hanging out. I think just a little bit of a preview of the next 2 weeks. This is probably going to be the last one show I do. Maybe I'll sneak something in there, but we're definitely winding down the format. I think people are exploring other formats. Strixhaven is out this week. Next week, we have Shadows over Innistrad Remastered. I'll definitely be doing content on that. We've also got, like I said, March of the Machine very, very soon, about a month's time. So we're kind of almost setting one off at this point, but look forward to both some content on Shadows over Innistrad Remastered and some generic level ups coming your way soon. All right, thank you for listening. We'll see you later.